The two-centered or Gothic arch is easily recognized by the smooth curves emanating from both endpoints, creating a point at the top. To lay out the basic two-centered arch, start with the span or spring line of the arch. The endpoints become the centers for the arcs that will make up this arch, and the span distance is the radius. Place the pivot point of your trammel on the endpoint and slide the marking point out to the opposite endpoint to set the radius. Swinging arcs above the spring line from both endpoints creates a two-centered arch. This type of two-centered arch is referred to as an equilateral arch because of the equilateral triangle created by connecting its 3 points. The two-centered arch also has a few variations. A taller, slender variation can be created by sliding the arch centers out along the spring line to points that are outside the arch's endpoints. This tall variation is called a Landset Arch, its sharp point reminiscent of a spear or lance. The height of an arch can also be reduced by moving the centers in along the spring line to points inside the endpoints. This variation is called a drop arch and has a very blunt point. It's important to note that the Gothic arch's height can only be reduced so far. If you continue to move the arch centers inward along the spring line, eventually the two center points will meet at the center of the span. The arch loses its pointed top and becomes a one-centered semicircular arch. It is possible to create a two-centered arch with a shorter rise. It's considered a modified Gothic arch and called a pointed segmental arch. For information on this variation, be sure to check out the quick reference guide for two-center arches. For this example, we'll find the centers for a drop arch. First, draw out the spring line and a perpendicular height line at the spring line's midpoint. Next, draw chords for the two arcs by using a straight edge to draw lines connecting the endpoints of the spring line to the top of the height line. Find the midpoints of both chords and draw perpendicular lines that extend across the height line through the spring line. The intersection points on the spring line become the two centers for this arch, and the required radius is the distance from the center points to the opposite endpoint. Place the pivot point of the trammel on one of the centers and slide the marking point out to the endpoint, then draw an arc across the top. Next, slide the pivot point to the other center and swing an arc to close off the top of the arch.